Imagine reading a geopolitical strategy paper, right? And it's written by a guy who proudly introduces himself as Barack Obama's first full-time volunteer in New York City.
Right, which immediately sets an expectation.
Exactly. You go into it expecting a certain tone, nuance, diplomacy, maybe some targeted sanctions, a very standard, measured approach to international relations.
Yeah, the typical Washington think tank playbook.
Yeah. But then by page 2 of this document, that exact same author is demanding that the United States military hunt down individual motorcycles in the streets of Iran.
It's incredible.
It is. He's quoting 7,000-year-old Hindu prophecies to justify uncompromising total war. He's writing about artificial intelligence, and he's declaring outright that Allah is actually the devil.
It is honestly one of the most jarring, stylistic, and ideological whiplashes you can encounter in a single piece of writing.
Oh, absolutely.
We have these granular, super bureaucratic details of global maritime shipping wall sitting right next to, like, apocalyptic end-of-days theology.
Yeah. And that is exactly what we are dissecting today. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are looking at a massive, incredibly opinionated geopolitical blog post dated March 27, 2026.
A really fascinating artifact.
It really is. The author is Paramendra Kumar Bhagat, and the piece is titled Barack Face, Tackling the Islamic Republic, Moral Clarity, Courage to Act, Tactics, and Strategy. But before we get into the weeds of this, we need to lay down a very firm foundation for you, the listener.
Yeah, this is crucial because the artifact we are examining today is highly volatile.
Very.
It contains extremely charged political viewpoints, hawkish and aggressive military proposals, and deeply controversial, highly inflammatory religious claims regarding Islam.
So we need to state this unequivocally right now. We are not taking sides.
Right.
We're not endorsing any of the left-wing, right-wing, or religious viewpoints contained in this text. Our mission today is purely forensic. We are going to impartially dissect the anatomy of this document.
Exactly. We just want to unpack the author's arguments, figure out the mechanical structure of his worldview, and convey the ideas exactly as he presented them.
We're analyzing how this piece operates as persuasion and commentary, nothing more.
Right, and to do that properly, we have to start by anchoring ourselves in the physical reality the author is describing in March of 2026.
Yeah, let's set the scene.
Because his theological leaps and his military demands, they don't just happen in a vacuum. They're triggered by a very specific, devastating crisis in the Middle East,
Which he describes in intense detail.
He paints a picture of a global economy that is effectively being held hostage. The text focuses intensely on the Strait of Hormuz, which, is one of the most vital maritime choke points on Earth.
Right.
And according to this document, the standard rules of international commerce there have completely broken down.
I want to look at the mechanics of that breakdown, because he doesn't just say, trade is blocked.
Yeah.
He gets into the absolute granular reality of how a maritime choke point is weaponized.
Yeah, he gets very technical.
He describes how, historically, massive cargo ships and oil tankers use a specific two-lane shipping channel right in the middle of the strait. It's an international artery. But in his 2026 scenario, that has changed.
Everything is shifted.
Right. Vessels are now being forced to take a massive detour, heading north around an island called Larak Island.
And that geographical shift is everything, because routing ships north of Larak Island pushes them directly into Iranian territorial waters.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, and once you cross that invisible line in the ocean, the international protocols that usually govern free trade begin to evaporate.
So it's a completely different legal jurisdiction suddenly.
Exactly. The author relies on data from Lloyd's List Intelligence, which is essentially the gold standard data broker for global maritime shipping, to explain the new operating procedure.
What does that procedure look like?
Entities that want their ships to pass through safely now have to submit a mountain of data to what are being termed approved intermediaries of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
And this isn't just a friendly wave as you pass by, right? I mean, they have to submit the exact details of their cargo, the corporate ownership of the ship, the final destination port, and a comprehensive list of every crew member on board.
Every single detail.
If the IRGC approves your paperwork, you get a specific code, and your massive cargo vessel is literally escorted through the strait by an IRGC gunboat.
It's wild. He notes that oil shipments are getting priority, but every single vessel is undergoing what Lloyd's calls geopolitical vetting.
Geopolitical vetting, which is, a very sanitized, bureaucratic term for a very coercive reality.
Oh, absolutely.
Reading this, my first thought was a neighborhood watch gone completely rogue.
That's a great way to put it.
Imagine a public interstate highway that you take to work every day. Suddenly, a local militia sets up concrete barriers, stands there with clipboards and assault rifles, and says, "Who are you? What's in your trunk? Where do you work? And how much are you going to pay us to not slash your tires?"
All right, it's a shakedown.
But what I really don't understand is the legal mechanism here. The author quotes a maritime historian, Sal Mercogliano, who points out that under international law, specifically Article 19 of the UN's Law of the Sea Treaty, peaceful vessels are guaranteed innocent passage.
Yes.
You cannot legally set up a toll booth on an international strait. So how is a geopolitical toll booth actually functioning if the entire international community knows it's illegal?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the short answer is that international law only exists if someone is willing to enforce it.
Oh, right.
Article 19 guarantees innocent passage on paper, sure. But the IRGC gunboat escorting the oil tanker, that is reality.
That's the hard power.
Exactly. The author highlights how the Iranian government is attempting to bridge this gap between illegal coercion and international legitimacy.
Yeah.
They aren't calling it a shakedown.
Of course not.
According to a letter they submitted to the International Maritime Organization, they're implementing precautionary measures aimed at preserving maritime safety and security.
So they are using the language of administrative safety to cover up a military blockade.
Exactly. And the text reveals they are taking it even further at the legislative level.
How so?
An Iranian lawmaker, Mohammad Reza Rezai Kuchi, is quoted saying their parliament is drafting a plan to formally codify Iran's sovereignty over the strait, specifically to create a legal source of revenue through the collection of fees.
Wow.
Yeah, they're attempting to write their coercive leverage into official law. But the most alarming part of this toll booth isn't just that tolls are being collected, it's how they're being paid.
Right, the currency aspect.
The author notes that while not every ship is paying a direct cash toll yet, at least 2 vessels have, and those payments were settled in yuan.
The Chinese currency? This detail clearly terrified the author, but I have to admit, I need this unpacked a bit. Why does the specific currency matter so much?
It's a huge deal.
Like, if a shipping company gets extorted, does it really matter if they hand over dollars, euros, or yuan? A shakedown is a shakedown, right?
It matters immensely because it strikes at the very foundation of American global power. Since the 1970s, the global oil trade has been overwhelmingly conducted in U.S. dollars.
The petrodollar system.
Exactly. Because every nation needs oil, every nation needs to hold massive reserves of U.S. dollars to buy it. This creates artificial, permanent global demand for the dollar.
Which gives the U.S. a massive advantage.
A huge advantage. It allows the United States to run massive deficits, borrow money cheaply, and effectively weaponize its financial system through sanctions. If you were cut off from the dollar, you were cut off from the globalist economy.
Okay, so the dollar isn't just money. It's the operating system for global trade.
Precisely. So when the IRGC forces shipping companies to pay transit tolls in yuan, they aren't just bypassing an international shipping lane.
Right.
They're bypassing the American financial operating system. It signals a shift toward a multipolar world where the U.S. dollar and, by extension, U.S. sanctions and leverage can be ignored.
That makes total sense.
The author actually includes a stark quote from Sultan Al-Jaber, an executive at a massive UAE oil company, to frame the stakes here. Al-Jaber calls this economic terrorism.
That quote really grounds the entire macroeconomic theory into something visceral.
Yeah.
Al-Jaber argues that weaponizing the Strait of Hormuz isn't just an attack on one specific nation or military. It's an attack on every consumer on Earth.
Yeah, he makes it very personal.
He says that when this choke point is held hostage, every single family pays the ransom at the gas pump, at the grocery store, and at the pharmacy. It's a total global ripple effect.
And that global ripple effect, the sheer scale of the disruption, is the exact launch pad the author uses to radically shift the tone of his manifesto.
Which is where things get really intense.
Because to him, the economic strangulation, the tolls in yuan, the violated maritime laws, these are all just symptoms. They are surface-level bureaucratic details, masking a much deeper, much darker reality.
Right.
He argues that you cannot understand the Strait of Hormuz until you understand the fundamental nature of the enemy.
Which brings us to the most controversial, intense section of this entire text, the author's concept of moral clarity. And again, to you listening, a firm reminder, the theological and political views we are about to discuss are highly inflammatory.
Very much so.
We are examining them strictly to understand how this author justifies the extreme military strategy he eventually proposes. We are just the messengers here.
Right. The pivot here is structural. The author basically abandons maritime law and steps directly into absolutist theology.
Yeah, it's quite a leap.
He asserts that the official, unyielding goal of the Islamic Republic is not to defeat a military or capture territory. He claims their ultimate goal is the complete end of Israel, comparing the intent to Hitler, but specifying the chosen instrument is an atom bomb.
But he doesn't stop at regional conflict. He broadens the scope to the entire planet, which is wild.
Yeah, he really zooms out.
He writes that the office of the Ayatollah doesn't just make him the political head of a state. According to this author, the Ayatollah claims all Earth. And to justify this, the author attempts to redefine the entire religion of Islam in his own highly rigid terms. He claims that in this framework, being a Muslim is not a cultural identity or a personal faith, it is strictly a verb. He writes, "You obey. If you don't obey, you are not a Muslim."
He is constructing an inescapable binary for his readers. He claims the hierarchy is absolute. The Ayatollah obeys Allah, and the people obey the Ayatollah.
But then he takes a massive, staggering rhetorical leap.
He really does. He attacks the theological foundation of the religion itself. He explicitly states in the text, Allah does not exist.
Just flat out says it.
Yes. He claims there is no entity by that name in the spiritual or earthly realm. And he goes further, asserting that Allah is actually the devil who has intentionally distorted the concept of God to manipulate human beings.
He actually uses this bizarre colloquial phrasing for that, too. He says, the devil has managed to sell the Muslims the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah, it's such a weirdly casual way to phrase something so extreme.
Right. He argues that the deity described in the Quran lacks omnipotence because he cannot enter human history. He even denies the historical existence of the faith's founder, stating flatly, there is no historic Muhammad.
It's a total erasure.
He compares him to the biblical prophet Isaiah, claiming Isaiah's prophecies are demonstrably coming true today, while asserting Muhammad offered none. He essentially strips the faith of its religious status, labeling it an anti-religion driven entirely by coercion.
Yes.
His summary of this supposed anti-religion is, become Muslim or die. Stay Muslim or die.
We have to look at the mechanical function of this argument.
Yeah.
Why does a geopolitical blogger writing about shipping lanes suddenly become an amateur theologian denying the existence of a major world religion?
Right. What's the purpose of that?
It is a deliberate rhetorical tool. In standard geopolitics, you are dealing with rational state actors who have competing interests. You can negotiate over borders, trade tariffs, or shipping lanes.
Normal statecraft.
Exactly. But by defining the adversary not as a state, but as a literal manifestation of theological evil working on behalf of the devil, the author systematically destroys the very concept of diplomacy.
Because you can't compromise with that.
Right. You cannot negotiate a peace treaty with the devil. You can only destroy him.
Okay, let's unpack this, because here's where it gets really interesting. He's demanding we stop looking at this as a modern political conflict. He says, stop saying this is Israel's war. This is a classic fight between good and evil.
Yes, the cosmic framing.
And to frame this modern drone warfare conflict, he reaches back to ancient Hindu scripture. He cites the Ramayana, which he dates to 7,000 years ago, and the Mahabharata from 5,000 years ago.
Which is such a massive shift in scope.
It is. He tells his readers that an age of darkness that has gone on for more than 5,000 years now is about to end. That is what this is about. How do we even process this?
It's a lot to take in.
Does overlaying ancient cosmic good versus evil epics onto a 2026 shipping crisis actually help formulate strategy? Or does it just blind the strategist to reality?
Well, for this author, the cosmic framing is the strategy. It's what he defines as moral clarity. The epics he references, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, are foundational texts of Hinduism that deal deeply with dharma or cosmic duty.
Right.
And they deal with the absolute necessity of fighting righteous wars against overwhelming evil, even when it is incredibly destructive.
Right.
By invoking them, he's telling his readers that standard strategists are paralyzed because they're looking at spreadsheets and economic sanctions.
They're too focused on the mundane details.
Exactly. They are blinded by nuance. The author believes that the truly evil do not reason, and that they will always fight to the finish.
Wow.
Therefore, to combat them, you need a spiritual mandate that allows you to also fight to the finish without hesitation or compromise.
He writes out so plainly, too. He says you achieve moral clarity and you fight to the finish, which leads us directly into his next major concept, which he calls the courage to act.
Right, the binary of war.
He sets up this fascinating, kind of terrifying binary regarding war. He pays brief lip service to the idea that war should be the weapon of last resort. But he immediately undercuts that by claiming that a philosophy of no war, never under no circumstances, is actually a profound moral failure.
Yes.
He views a reluctance to fight as a lack of courage.
And to insulate himself from the accusation of being a pure warmonger, he builds a highly specific historical framework to prove that, in this March 2026 scenario, total war has become mathematically unavoidable.
How does he justify that?
He argues that the United States and its allies provided the Islamic Republic with multiple peaceful off-ramps, and every single one was rejected.
Ah, yes. He lists 4 specific off-ramps. First, he says they could have ended their nuclear program. He argues that if they genuinely just wanted civilian nuclear energy, they could have easily accepted nuclear fuel from Russia instead of enriching their own.
Right, that's one.
Second, they could have curbed their ballistic missile program. Third, they could have dismantled their network of proxy militias across the region. And fourth, they could have simply stopped killing peaceful protesters in their own streets.
All major points of contention.
Right. He summarizes this by writing, "It refused to give an inch on any of the 4. That made war unavoidable." But I really have to push back on this framing.
Go for it.
When you look at those 4 items, nuclear, missiles, proxies, internal regime survival, that's not a list of diplomatic off-ramps. That is the entire comprehensive list of Western grievances against Iran.
Yes, it is.
Is he outlining a genuine history of failed diplomacy, or is he just building a retroactive checklist to justify total war to his readers?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your skepticism is entirely warranted. It gets to the core of how ultimatums function in war justification.
Exactly.
Bundling those 4 massive existential pillars of Iranian state policy into a single take-it-or-leave-it package is not a diplomatic negotiation. It is a demand for total capitulation.
It's surrender before the war even starts.
Right. He has created a closed logical loop. He starts with the premise that the enemy is theologically evil and incapable of compromise. He then presents a list of demands that would effectively dismantle the enemy's entire geopolitical and domestic power structure.
Which they obviously won't accept.
Exactly. When they inevitably refuse to dismantle themselves, he points to that refusal as proof that they have chosen war, which triggers his moral requirement for the courage to act.
He literally says, you don't fight because you are stronger. You fight because you have moral clarity, and you have exhausted all peaceful options. But the peaceful option was essentially suicide for the regime.
Exactly. And once he establishes that this war is a cosmic moral necessity, he turns his attention to the people actually tasked with fighting at the United States government and military. And his frustration here is palpable.
Oh, yeah. This is where we get into his critique of the hegemon, the U.S., and it's fascinating because of the author's background.
It really is.
We have to remember the contradiction from the very beginning. This guy was Barack Obama's first full-time volunteer in NYC. Yet, his critique of American strategy and tactics is absolutely relentless.
He doesn't hold back.
Let's look at his view of the military first. He is utterly baffled by the tactical paralysis of the U.S. armed forces. He points out that the U.S. spends more on defense annually than the entire GDP of most nations on Earth. It is historically the mightiest military ever assembled.
True.
Yet, a month into this 2026 conflict, they cannot stop drone strikes, and they cannot force open the Strait of Hormuz. He asks, what is going on?
It's a fair question from his perspective.
It feels like watching a heavyweight boxing champion get into the ring and suddenly he can't figure out how to throw a punch because his opponent is throwing sand in his eyes.
Mm-hmm.
So what does this all mean for his view of American power? Why is this massive military machine failing in his eyes?
Because the author is watching a conventional military superpower try to fight an asymmetric shadow war. Aircraft carriers and stealth bombers are designed to destroy other nation-states' conventional militaries, but they are incredibly inefficient tools for dealing with decentralized proxy militias, drone swarms that cost a few $1,000s, and deeply buried decentralized command nodes.
It's the wrong tool for the job.
Exactly. The author notes that military experts are criticizing the U.S. for fighting as if it's World War II, looking for massive, decisive battles that simply don't exist in this theater. However, the author's critique doesn't stop at the generals.
No, it goes much higher.
Right. He argues that tactical failure on the ground is always the result of strategic failure at the top. And this is where he takes a sledgehammer to the legacy of the administration he once volunteered for.
The Obama paradox in this text is just wild. The author addresses the Iran nuclear deal directly. He brings up the common defense that Obama already figured this out, and he flatly responds, not true.
Yeah, a complete reversal.
I need you to explain his logic here, because the nuclear deal was supposed to be the ultimate diplomatic victory. Why does this former volunteer view it as a strategic disaster?
Well, the author attacked the mechanical reality of the deal. He argues that while the agreement may have capped uranium enrichment at a certain percentage, it fundamentally allowed Iran to maintain and protect its nuclear infrastructure.
The centrifuges, the facility.
Yes, the underground facilities. In his view, leaving the infrastructure intact means the regime can easily break out and enrich to weapons-grade levels whenever they choose. But more importantly, he attacks the financial mechanism of the deal.
Right, the lifting of sanctions.
Exactly. When sanctions were lifted as part of the agreement, massive amounts of frozen capital flowed back into the Iranian economy. The author argues that this money was not used to build roads or hospitals.
What does he claim it funded?
He claims it funded Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis to the hilt. He argues it paid for the construction of subterranean missile cities and the development of hypersonic weapons. In his mind, the diplomatic victory of the Obama era directly funded the military reality that is holding the global economy hostage in 2026.
He writes, Obama did many good things, but lifting sanctions on Iran was not one of them. But what really caught my eye is how he broadens his definition of bad strategy.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
He doesn't just critique Middle East policy, he rattles off a list of examples of American strategic failure that seem entirely random.
Oddly disjointed.
He says bad strategy is failing to wargame scenarios years in advance. Sure, that tracks. But then he says bad strategy is airports across America falling into utter chaos while the world watches.
Right.
He complains about NATO members being miffed. The most confusing one, he says bad strategy is the U.S. imposing tariffs on Lesotho, a small African nation, which the U.S. Supreme Court later found illegal.
Yeah, that one stands out.
I honestly stared at that line for 10 minutes.
Huh.
Why is a Supreme Court ruling on Lesotho tariffs appearing in a manifesto about a holy war in the Middle East?
Because for this author, strategy is not a specific policy document sitting on a desk at the Pentagon. Strategy is the holistic operating system of a nation. It is a measure of state capacity and competence.
Ah, I see.
He looks at chaos at American airports, diplomatic friction with European allies, and an unconstitutional tariff applied to Lesotho, and he sees symptoms of the exact same disease, a sclerotic, reactive, and incoherent government apparatus.
Everything is connected.
Exactly. He defines good strategy as dynamic, something that moves with markets, adapts to opinion polls, and shifts in real time. If your domestic infrastructure is failing and your trade departments are executing illegal tariffs, you simply do not have the institutional competence to execute a complex multi-front war in the Middle East.
He sums it up by saying strategy decides if this war lasts a few short weeks or a few suicidal months. And a massive piece of his strategic critique is that the U.S. government is ignoring the most important variable, the Iranian people.
Yes, the domestic element.
He argues that obsessing over nukes, missiles, and proxies is lopsided if you don't center the population. Which brings us to a specific historical event he highlights in the text, and his incredibly harsh, almost cruel judgment of it.
This is a really pivotal moment in the document. The author anchors his argument around a massive event that takes place on February 14th, 2026.
Right.
According to the text, close to 2 million Iranians in the diaspora, people living outside the country, took to the streets globally to protest the regime. He acknowledges the scale of this, calling it an unprecedented show of strength and political consciousness.
But immediately after praising the scale, he absolutely eviscerates the protesters.
He really does.
He claims their effort fell short because the diaspora lacks moral clarity. And his logic here is brutal. He addresses the core grievance of the protests that the regime shouldn't be killing its citizens, and he asks why. That is what they signed up for.
It's a shocking statement.
It really is. He falls back on his rigid theological binary. He claims that in the system of the Islamic Republic, Muslims do not protest, they obey. If you protest, you cease to obey. You cease to be Muslim. And in the eyes of the state, you become worthy of death.
Yeah.
He tells the diaspora protesters, you signed up for it. I really struggle with this part. It feels like ultimate victim blaming.
This raises an important question about his philosophy because it is a profoundly severe rhetorical turn. He is arguing that you cannot petition an absolute theocratic regime for democratic liberty because the regime's very foundation rejects the concept of individual liberty.
That it's incompatible.
The author claims that the Ayatollah cannot grant freedom, only the individual can grant it to themselves. And this leads to his theory of liberation, which is perhaps the most extreme purity test imaginable.
Right. He demands that the diaspora explicitly renounce Islam. He requires mass religious conversion as a prerequisite for political freedom.
Yes, total defect.
He uses this vivid analogy to explain his frustration. He asks the reader to imagine Russian dissidents fleeing the Soviet Union to the West in 1987, enjoying free speech and assembly, but remaining diehard ideological communists. He views the religion and the oppressive state apparatus as inextricably perfectly linked.
In his framework, the faith itself is the operating system of the oppression. Therefore, you cannot be a true political dissident while maintaining the faith.
It's all or nothing.
It is a totalizing, absolutist view of the conflict. It completely erases the existence of reformists, moderates, or cultural Muslims who oppose the regime. For the author, liberation requires a complete spiritual defection.
And what's wild is that as extreme as his demands are for the Iranian people, his tactical demands for the U.S. military are somehow even more convoluted.
Oh, definitely.
He dismisses the idea of a negotiated peace, stating the U.S. military simply needs to win, his proposal. Send in ground troops to take over just one specific node in the underground command center, claiming that knocking out one node will bring down the entire decentralized network.
Which is highly optimistic. Yeah. But then he pitches his grand strategic solution. A U.S. unilateral ceasefire, a 4-week renewable pause in major military operations, but with one incredibly strict provision.
The micro-policing provision.
Right. If regime enforcers, who he calls goons on motorbikes, attack peaceful Iranian protesters in the streets, the U.S. military will automatically swing into motion to target and eliminate those specific attackers.
We really have to unpack the logistical absurdity and the philosophical contradiction of this proposal.
Please do.
Logistically, he is asking a superpower military, equipped with high-altitude bombers and aircraft carriers, to act as a localized, hyper-vigilant SWAT team in the dense urban streets of Iranian cities.
Which is just not how those assets work.
Not at all. He envisions a scenario where U.S. military assets are hovering over protests, tracking individual men on motorcycles, and executing precision strikes in real time to protect civilians. It blends the macro scale of international warfare with the micro scale of urban policing in a way that is tactically near impossible. But the philosophical contradiction is what really gets me. He's demanding intense U.S. military intervention, yet ends by saying, only the Iranian people can ensure victory in this war. How on earth do those two concepts coexist in his head?
It's a massive clash of ideas.
He demands the Iranian people achieve victory through a massive internal spiritual revolution, but simultaneously demands the U.S. military act as their personal microscopic bodyguard while they do it. It's like saying, you must walk through the fire alone, but I'm going to hold an umbrella over you the whole time.
The contradiction is actually the key to understanding his mindset. He is trying to reconcile two massive competing beliefs.
Which are?
On one hand, he has an unshakable belief in American hegemonic power and its responsibility to police the globe. On the other hand, he holds a deep, almost spiritual belief in individual agency and local revolution.
I see.
He wants the U.S. military to freeze the conflict, to create an artificial, impenetrable bubble of physical safety so that the Iranian people have the space to undergo the profound spiritual and political transformation he believes is necessary.
Okay, speaking of a mind trying to reconcile massive, disparate ideas, we have to zoom out. We've spent this whole time analyzing the text, but to truly understand how a document like this comes to exist, we need to look at the meta-context.
Absolutely essential.
We need to look at the blog itself and the sprawling mind of the author, Paramendra Kumar Bhagat.
Because when you look at the sidebar of this blog, you realize you aren't just reading an isolated op-ed. This isn't a burner account that popped up overnight to comment on a news cycle.
No, not at all.
The archives show continuous postings since 2004. The site has over 4.7 million page views. We are looking at decades of continuous, prolific output.
Reading the bibliography in that sidebar is an experience. It feels exactly like walking into a university professor's office where the walls are entirely covered in corkboards with red string furiously connecting geopolitics, ancient religion, and artificial intelligence.
A very chaotic energy.
Yeah, he has written books with titles like Agentic AI, set to explode in 2026, The Technologies Behind Agentic AI, and Liquid Computing, The Future of Human-Tech Symbiosis.
Heavy tech focus.
But sitting right next to those hard tech titles are books like Calciism, The Economic and Spiritual Blueprint for an Age of Abundance, and The Last Age, Lord Kalki, Prophecy, and the Final War for Peace.
Right. Spiritual texts.
And then, just to add another layer, he has a slew of fiction novels. The Great Subcontinent Uprising, Trump's Default, The Banyan Revolt. What are we looking at here? How do agentic AI and Kalki prophecy intersect with a military plan for the Strait of Hormuz?
This context fundamentally alters how we read the manifesto. This isn't a sterile foreign policy white paper submitted to a Washington think tank. It is a single chapter in a much larger, highly idiosyncratic master theory of the world.
Right.
Let's look at the tech side first. Agentic AI refers to artificial intelligence systems that don't just answer prompts, but actively pursue complex goals over time, making decisions and executing tasks autonomously. The author believes this technology is exploding in 2026.
Which changes everything.
Exactly. When you believe that humanity is on the verge of an AI singularity, a moment of exponential, uncontrollable technological change, your perception of time shifts. You no longer believe in the slow, generational process of traditional diplomacy.
You think everything is happening right now at light speed?
Exactly. And then you combine that tech futurism with his spiritual framework, which he calls Kalkiism. In Hindu eschatology, Kalki is the 10th and final incarnation of the god Vishnu.
Okay.
Prophecy dictates that Kalki will appear at the end of the Kali Yuga, the current age of darkness and moral decline, to destroy evil forces on a cosmic scale and usher in a new era of spiritual purity and moral order.
Wait, oh my God, that explains the line in the text.
Yes.
When he wrote that the age of darkness that has gone on for more than 5,000 years now is about to end, he wasn't just using a colorful, dramatic metaphor for a bad political situation.
Not at all.
He is viewing the drone strikes, the shipping blockades, and the U.S. military's performance through the literal lens of ancient, epic-ending prophecy.
Precisely. He is overlaying the eschatology of the Kalki avatar onto the geopolitical crisis of the Middle East. If you genuinely believe that you are standing at the exact intersection of an artificial intelligence singularity and the prophesied end of a 5,000-year spiritual age of darkness, your policy proposals are naturally going to be absolute.
You're not going to be asking for minor concessions.
Right. You aren't going to advocate for trade tariffs or minor border adjustments. You are going to demand ultimate moral clarity, mass religious conversion, and a total uncompromising victory over what you perceive as cosmic evil.
It makes the entire bizarre document click into place. It explains the whiplash we felt on page 1.
Yeah, it ties it all together.
You have a guy who cut his teeth doing grassroots political volunteering for Barack Obama in New York City.
Yeah.
He then becomes deeply obsessed with the exponential curve of artificial intelligence, intertwines that with a profound belief in Hindu end times prophecy, and becomes intensely frustrated by the sluggish, bureaucratic reality of American military power.
It's quite the cocktail.
And he pours all of those massive conflicting inputs into a single blog post on a Friday in March 2026.
It is a remarkable, almost overwhelming artifact of modern independent media. It perfectly illustrates how an individual in the digital age can construct an entirely self-contained worldview.
It really does.
He synthesizes real-time global trade data from Lloyd's List intelligence with ancient scriptures and futuristic tech trends, and he broadcasts that synthesized reality to an audience of millions, completely bypassing any traditional editorial oversight or peer review.
Okay, let's take a collective breath and try to synthesize the intense journey we've just been on.
Sound good.
We started in the murky, contested waters of the Strait of Hormuz, examining how the IRGC is using bureaucratic-approved intermediaries and the Chinese yuan to bypass the American petrodollar and establish a geopolitical toll booth.
Right.
We watched the author pivot from maritime law into incredibly fraught, controversial theology, redefining the Islamic Republic not as a state but as a literal manifestation of the devil to justify abandoning diplomacy.
A massive conceptual leap.
We explored his harsh critiques of the U.S. military's inability to fight asymmetric warfare and his frustration with the strategic legacy of the Obama administration. We dissected his brutal purity test for the Iranian diaspora, demanding religious defection for political freedom.
The mass conversion requirement.
Right. And finally, we zoomed out to see how all of this is filtered through the mind of a tech futurist waiting for the AI singularity and the end of a 5,000-year age of darkness.
We've essentially mapped the anatomy of a deeply unconventional, highly polarized mind. We've seen how this author defines a global problem not as a border dispute or an economic rivalry, but as a spiritual infection that must be eradicated with absolute moral clarity and overwhelming micromanaged force.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought to chew on. We live in an era where literally anyone with a laptop can publish a sprawling manifesto that blends 7,000-year-old scripture, cutting-edge artificial intelligence predictions, and granular tactical military advice into a single breathless post.
And reach millions of people.
Exactly. And as we saw with the millions of page views on this blog, people are reading it. As you navigate the endless stream of news and analysis today, ask yourself, how does this total democratization of expert commentary change the way public opinion and perhaps even policy forms around global conflicts?
It's a fundamental shift in how information moves.
When everyone with a keyboard can declare themselves a grand strategist and the line between geopolitical analysis and apocalyptic prophecy gets blurred in a blog sidebar, how do we separate the signal from the noise? When the world is this complex, how do we ensure we are following a strategy and not just a story?
That is the defining question of the information age. Thank you for exploring this fascinating, chaotic document with us.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.